Let's make a start, respected guests, respected panelists, imams. Thank you sincerely for attending tonight. It has been a difficult series of events to organize with the unfortunate events of Mubarak not being able to make it to Australia at a fairly short notice. But I'm sure that tonight will be a very special panel. Particularly that it's probably the first time in Australia that I'm aware of where opposite sides of the political spectrum in Egypt, as well as independents, sit together on one panel and talk about the issues that are occurring in Egypt. The event is organized by the Australians for Democracy and Human Rights in Egypt. It's an organization, an NGO, a not-for-profit that has been established briefly after the advent of the coup in Egypt, primarily to provide a vehicle for interested Australians to contribute to the efforts to bring about a meaningful and sustainable change to the way Egypt is governed and the way its citizens are engaged, and calls for a civilian rule and transfer of power only via fair and transparent elections, the primacy of law applied in accordance with the Constitution, strong civil institutions, basic human rights for all Egyptians, including the right for minimum living standards, and a fair and balanced and independent media. The forum is titled tonight, what should the role of faith groups and NGOs be in charting a free and just and pluralistic future for Egypt. I'm not going to introduce the panelists tonight. I'm going to leave it to the moderator, which is Maher Mughrabi. Mr. Mughrabi, I'm going to introduce Maher. Maher Mughrabi is the foreign news editor of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. He has worked in newspapers in Britain, United Arab Emirates, and of course as well as Australia. And he has lectured at Melbourne University, Monash University, and Latrobe University. And he has particularly on the topic of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the history of the Middle East. So just before we start, a couple of things to say, I guess, is that emergency exits, on the left-hand side of the room as well, on the right-hand side of the room. Toilets are on the left-hand side. And also, one more thing to say as well, we have with us as well the Grand Mufti of the Muslim community here. He will not be on the panel, primarily because he will only communicate in Arabic, but he will give a brief, a few words after the session is ended. So I will now hand over to Maher Mughrabi to take over.
Discussion, which will hopefully take up most of the meeting, and then there will be a short period at the end where they have a couple of minutes to address any remarks in conclusion. But I would like to begin by providing a little bit of insight into my own role as a moderator this evening. As mundane as it may seem, it is my firm belief that one of the most serious problems that faces Egypt and indeed the wider Middle East today is the failure to create space for civil conversation. And I use the word civil to mean both polite and what we would describe in Arabic with the word madani, in the public square civil. Tonight my aim is to ensure that we set an example in this regard. I'm aware that there are very strong feelings and very serious issues to cover here, issues of life and death. I don't think it's an understatement to say. But to do them justice, I think it's essential that people are allowed to ask and to answer questions in peace, and that questions and answers are genuine and to the point, rather than being rehearsed speeches or proclamations. It is my job to make sure that that happens. And while I hope to intervene as little as possible in the discussion, be assured that I will do so if it becomes necessary. I thank you in advance for your cooperation and your patience. And now to our guests. To my right, to my far right, although mostly not on the spectrum, Professor Joseph Camilleri. I can think of very few academics in an Australian context who might be more useful to us in a political dialogue than Professor Camilleri, who teaches at Latrobe University, and who has just finished 7 years as the founding director of the Centre for Dialogue at that university, and who has written and co-edited such books as Culture, Religion and Conflict in Muslim Southeast Asia, and Worlds in Transition, Evolving Governance Across a Stressed Planet, and indeed The End of Sovereignty, which might be a very useful book for us to go back to at this time. So that's Professor Camilleri on my extreme right. Then Dr. Magdy, a GP working here, working in fact in a practice very near my house, a prominent member of the Coptic community and a community activist who's very courteously come here tonight to speak. And finally, Adel Salman, who works in the business community but is also an active volunteer within the Australian Muslim community and an alumnus of the Asia Link Leadership Programme. So those are our three panelists, and without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Camilleri to make some remarks about the situation in Egypt as he sees it.
Thank you very much, Maher. It's a pleasure to be here, and I should explain right at the beginning that I come not as an expert on Egypt by any stretch of the imagination, though I do try and follow, of course, developments in that country closely, not least because it's the country of my birth. My first 12 years were in Egypt. I think we all know, and I hardly need stated, that what is happening in Egypt has been for the last few years is of enormous significance, of course, to the future of Egypt, but given Egypt's importance within the Arab world, in the Middle East and beyond, what happens in Egypt clearly is going to have very substantial implications for the region and beyond. And of course, it is of considerable interest to the diasporic communities that come from Egypt. Now, all I want to do is just offer a couple of reflections. And I suspect that there is a wealth of knowledge here in this room, and probably a lot of more knowledge than I have about many of the specifics, and hopefully some of that will come out in the course of the discussion later on. I think we all know that a very significant event in the life of Egypt in recent times was the fall of the Mubarak regime. And we also know that a great many people were involved in those tumultuous events. And in the eyes and the view of many, inside and outside Egypt, on the whole, this was seen to be a positive development. But I think, and I share that view generally speaking, but I think in terms of commentators and analysts, there hasn't been sufficient attention to the dynamics of what actually transpired. The first thing I think that should be said is that the removal of an individual, even though he be the leader, even though he may have been the leader for some considerable time, does not mean the removal of a power structure. And I think there was probably, amongst many, inside Egypt and outside, a failure to distinguish between the fall of a leader and the kind of radical shift that would be necessary for a change in social, political, and perhaps even economic system within a country. And so there may well have been, on the part of those who were instrumental, but I don't want to say it more than that, instrumental in bringing about this change, and there were lots of people from different backgrounds and different perspectives, perhaps not quite the sophisticated analysis that perhaps we are able to see now, 2 or 3 years later. think, first of all, it has to be understood that while the protests in the streets were very important, they were not the only decisive factor that brought about the shift. I think it's probably fair to say that there were divisions within the power structure that had evolved over time, over the previous 20 or more years, and some saw this as an opportunity. And therefore perhaps the role of the military was not understood as clearly as might have been the case. I think there are two major pillars. The military is one, and the security establishment is another. And as we know, they're not necessarily one and the same thing. So I think there was a failure to distinguish, and clearly and sharply. And there was, I think, also, with hindsight, a failure on the part of those who were keen to see the end of the Mubarak period and the Mubarak regime, that unless there was a fairly a reasonable capacity developed very quickly on the part of all those who, either from early on or later on, took part in the demonstrations and generally the clamour for a change, to engage in a very intensive and continuing dialogue. It didn't happen then, not really, and we shouldn't therefore be surprised that it's not happening right now. And the next point I'm going to make is really the final point I want to make, because I think it gets to the situation where we find ourselves. You cannot have, in my view, significant, meaningful moves towards stable change, long-term change that sticks, unless there is, and this is in line with what perhaps Maher was telling us a moment ago, unless there is a profound conversation, which I would call dialogue, involving key stakeholders in the society, recognizing that there are differences, and perhaps even substantial differences, but nevertheless a willingness to enter into a serious ongoing dialogue that recognizes the differences and in the light of those differences still attempts to build over time some relationships based on mutual trust. Easy to say, I know, but very difficult to do, but critically important. So the point I'm trying to make is moves towards democracy, systems of government that are transparent and accountable, a culture of transparency, a system of human rights cannot possibly be built, impossible, by any one grouping in what is a diverse and at times polarized society. Impossible. So it is important, I think, to identify who are the key stakeholders in what is the diversity that is Egyptian society, and that I see as the principal role of religious, civil society, NGO groups and others, to see what can be done to engage in a reasonably inclusive dialogue, precisely about how one moves a society that has been engaged in a kind of sclerotic frame of reference in order to be able to move the distance over a period of time. I don't believe that dialogue, there have been initiatives of course, but in terms of a nationwide sustained dialogue that involves key stakeholders, and we can begin to name them in the conversation, I think that still remains to happen. And there needs to be leadership shown by critical groups within society to see whether that dialogue can begin to take place. And it's certainly a dialogue that must have as its purpose some kind of the development of some kind of transparent, accountable system, which is concerned, of course, with the human rights of the person, but not just civil and political, but also social and economic. That is also concerned with the responsibilities, not just rights, but the responsibilities, not just of individuals, groups.
Can I call you to wind up?
Yeah.
That's sure. You wind up now?
I'm glad that.
Super. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut across your
No, that's it.
That's very good. That's it.
And to go ahead with what they were going to say anyway, since you mentioned sclerotic processes, I thought perhaps that Dr. Ramzy would go next, but I think maybe Mr. Salman should go next and Dr. Ramzy should help us with the sclerosis at the end. Okay, so, Adel, you're up.
Thank you. Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for attending. First of all, say that I'm very honoured to be on the same panel with Professor Camilleri and also Dr. Ramzy. I met Dr. Ramzy a few weeks ago. We were also part of a panel discussion at Latrobe University, and I commended him for his enormous courage in participating in the panel, given that he knew he was walking into hostile territory. He conducted himself with much grace, and we really are very pleased to have him here today. And I hope, Dr. Magdy, that you won't be getting all of the questions like you did last time. I think I will try to specifically address the actual question before us. What should be the role of faith groups and NGOs in the charter of a free, just, and pluralistic future for Egypt? I think any answer to that question, and it's a challenge really, any answer to that challenge needs to take into account the context of Egypt today. The context of Egypt today is very complex, extremely complex. In fact, it could not be more complex. This is a nation in flux. This is a society in flux. It's a society that is in transition. There's turmoil. There's incredible division and polarisation. Maher spoke about the public space and civil discourse. That does not exist in Egypt today. And I think Professor Camilleri was speaking about the need to have that dialogue. Well, I couldn't agree more. In fact, that need is a desperate need now, and the country cannot move forward unless that actually takes place. So then, what role can faith groups and NGOs play in this current period? And we're not talking about the next 5, 10, 15 years, we're talking right now, and I think they do have a role right now. They're complementary roles, they actually overlap, but they also serve quite unique and important purposes in their own right. If I take faith groups, Egypt is the country of faith. And I say that in the sense that the overt signs of religiosity are everywhere to be found in Egypt. One could argue that Egypt has a long secular tradition, and that is true. And if you know the Egyptian history, you know that to be absolute fact. Egypt has a very strong secular tradition dating back for decades. And in fact, that's one of the issues that Egyptians and Egyptian society are now grappling with, is the impact of that almost indoctrination that has taken place over decades, particularly since the overthrow of the monarchy back in 1952. But there's no question that faith groups in Egypt, and let's talk about the two major faith groups, obviously Islam and Christianity. We would like to think, and I would like to think, that they play the role of the moral voice in the country, a soothing and a healing role in the country. The need for that could not be greater. So I see the role of the faith groups, the leadership of these faith groups, as quite critical to actually calm the events down, calm the people down, play the role of moral voice, calling for respect for the views of others, the respect for the humanity of others, and actually holding the government, whoever that government is, to account. That's the role I see of the faith groups in Egypt today. They play really a role of conciliator and trying to bring the parties together and facilitate that dialogue that we've just spoken about. They obviously will play other roles. They play roles that are specific to their constituency. They play roles which are humanitarian in nature. And of course they play a specific faith or religious role. But around the question and around the context of Egypt today, I think they have a very important role around moral voice, a soothing, healing, calming force in the country, bringing the parties together and calling the authorities to account. In terms of NGOs, and the definition of NGOs is very broad. It could be a human rights organisation, it could be an educational organisation, it could be one that's focused on education, training, employment, etc., etc. I mean, the diversity of the spectrum is huge. But at a general, if I take it up a level to the general principle, NGOs in Egypt today will perform a role or roles that the government cannot or chooses not to perform. They also will play the role of allowing Egyptians who want to participate in Egypt's transition and roadmap to a better place, provides them an outlet. If you look at it, what are the outlets they could get involved with in politics, in movements? Many people will choose to become involved in tangible projects, and NGOs provide that for. I think NGOs also have a role in calling governments or holding them to account as well. And I'm thinking specifically of human rights organisations. Unfortunately, today, the human rights organisations, the Egyptian human rights organisations, are not playing that role. And there is a real deficit in terms of moral clarity amongst Egyptian NGOs, and there's clearly a deficit in capability. And one of the issues facing Egypt today is that we have the Egyptian NGOs that are effectively mouthpieces to some regard for the regime, the military regime, and they're almost accomplices in the events that have taken place, undemocratic, tyrannical steps that have been taken by the military regime in Egypt since the July 3rd coup. They need, I think, to examine their role very closely. They have a responsibility, and unless they act on principle, then they will lose whatever credibility they had, or they could have, in building a free, just, and pluralistic future in Egypt. Did I make that?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much, Mr. Salman. Now, Dr. Ramzy, you have the floor.
My fellow Egyptians and my fellow Australians who are here today, I'm grateful for what Adel have said about the courage and the hostile environment that I was facing the other time, but there was the welcoming, warm, kind Egyptian attitude that I know is true about true Egyptians. And it would probably be difficult for me to talk without mentioning the organization of the Muslim Brotherhood. So I might start by saying that when I talk about the organization, I don't talk about everyone that belongs to the organization. I talk about the organization as a strategy, as an ideology, as ways of achieving this ideology, as principles, but I am not talking about the base members of the organization, because I believe, and I might just start from here then, and we all know that the Muslim Brotherhood as an organization is ranking its members. So there is a top, and then there is layers, and every layer has limited right in knowing what the layers above know. So by the time you come to the base members, they know really very little on what goes on the top. I have read a lot of history and followed a
lot, all the organizations, and of course the Muslim Brotherhood is an important organization in the society, and hence I had a special interest in following its history. Two principles they are based on, and why I am starting with this because it is very relevant to what I'm going to talk about. The first principle is listen and obey. So don't discuss right or wrong, put your faith in me, and it's listen and obey. And I think everyone can derive from this what they want. The second principle that I heard over and over and over with them, because of course in the last year there's no single program on television or the media that didn't have one of the leaders of that organization in it, including the independent media programs that were attacked after that. But the second principle is that the essential permits the unpermittable. And we've all heard that from their leaders over and over. And محظورات تبيح and سمعناها. So the essentials permits the unpermittable, which means I can break the rules if there is something that is important for me. It's okay to break this because I have something essential or more important to achieve. So with those two principles, you really can commit every sin on earth. And if everyone applied these rules to themselves, I mean, it would be chaos. A year of governance from Mr. Morsi and his organization, there is some facts and then there is my own view. I think there is a fact that a lot of people forgot that Mr. Morsi was an escapee from prison that has never really cleared his name. And I have no idea really how he came to a point where to be one of the people that we elected for presidency of a country like Egypt without having to clear his name, and how did he escape from prison? What happened? Why was he in prison to start with? And was he innocent? Was he... But anyway, Egypt has never really known free and transparent elections, and make no mistake, the last one was not also clear of any violation, but that's a different story. He was elected in the year after that. It was an absolute tragedy really for Egypt on all accounts. And we can talk about those details if anyone is interested, whether economic, political, human rights, on all accounts. And above all of those, the most important item was the national security. Internally, we have a society that is divided, completely divided. He has failed to really govern the Egyptians as a whole people. He has failed to give them the feeling that he's a president for all people. And hence the split that we see now, and I think that is his biggest sin. Secondly, is the national security that is at great risk, and we realize how much it was at risk now. We know that every day soldiers and police officers are falling and being assassinated, killed, bombed. And these are people who defend our country internally and on the borders. If they fall, or if an army and a police collapse, what is left in the country? In absolute chaos. Egypt is striving for democracy, striving for human rights, but not the democracy of Iran, not the democracy of Afghanistan, and definitely not the democracy that was left behind in Iraq or currently in Syria and Libya. I don't think any Egyptian wished that for his country. And the only thing really that is holding Egypt from being another copy of this country in a chaos in the moment is the fact that it has got a good, an integral, and a loyal, and a national army. internal police have taken a lot of hits and has been weakened tremendously, especially after the ousting of Mr. Morsi, when the police stations were attacked, burned, the police officers were slaughtered, dragged in the middle of the street. The Christians have paid a big price by having their church burned in a single week, more than 60 of those churches. I don't know what the Christians really commit to have to be subjected to this. But this is the chaos that the Muslim Brotherhood and their affiliated group, and I'm just saying affiliated, but I really believe there is a very strong cooperation and connection between the Muslim Brotherhood as an organization and all the other organizations that that are armed and work in terrorism. Mr. Camilleri said something that is very true. Events in Egypt don't affect only Egypt. I think they affect the area and the world. I'd love to hear also from the Mufti, I'm coming to talk as an Egyptian, not as a Christian, okay? And I would like to understand why there is so many Islamic radical groups now. Each of them believe they know the real Islam, which is different from the other group, and the other group, and the other group, and different from Al-Azhar group, where I have learned what Islam is about. I have learned how people can live together in harmony and peace. So I'd love to also have his feedback about that. Thank you very much for listening to me and being tolerant to me.